It was nearly 3 a.m. and the truck stop on Route 65 was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the neon lights flickering above the gas pumps. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and stale coffee. Tired travelers and truckers in faded flannel shirts sat hunched over at the greasy diner counter, their eyes glazed, lost in thought or whatever desperate attempt at sleep they could manage in the cramped booths. Tasha, a long-haul trucker herself, pulled her rig into one of the far parking spots. She'd been on the road for hours and the exhaustion was beginning to wear her down. A few hours of rest and some hot food were all she needed to push through the last leg of her journey. She swung open the door of her cab, letting the cool night air hit her face as she stepped out. Her boots clicked against the cracked asphalt as she made her way toward the diner, the sound of her steps mingling with the distant growl of idling engines. The diner was almost empty, just a few truckers nursing mugs of coffee. The waitress behind the counter, a tired-looking woman with bags under her eyes, nodded as Tasha slid onto a stool. "Anything for you?" she asked, her voice low, as if she were too tired to speak louder. "Just coffee," Tasha replied, rubbing her temples. "And a burger, I guess. Needs something greasy." The waitress shuffled off to the kitchen without another word. Tasha leaned her elbows on the counter and glanced around, her gaze briefly landing on a man sitting at the far corner of the diner. He was hunched over a bowl of soup, his back to her, his long coat draped over the back of his chair. There was something unsettling about him, the way he sat so still, almost too still. His hair was slicked back too perfectly, and though the air was chilly, there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. The man's hands, long and thin, were wrapped around the spoon as if he were gripping it too tightly. Tasha tried to ignore him, chalking it up to her exhaustion, but the longer she sat, the more she felt his presence crawling over her skin like 1,000 tiny ants. Every time she glanced in his direction, she could swear he was staring at her, though his head never turned. Her burger arrived with a side of fries, and she tried to focus on the food, but her appetite had soured. Her mind kept wandering back to that man. There was something wrong with him, something off. The waitress came back with a fresh pot of coffee and set it in front of her. "You good?" she asked, her voice weary but kind. "Yeah," Tasha mumbled, still uneasy. "Just that guy in the corner. He's been there a while, hasn't he?" The waitress glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He comes through every now and then. Never stays long. Just keeps to himself. People say he's not right in the head." "Not right in the head?" Tasha echoed, her unease growing. "What do you mean by that? Just a weird vibe," the waitress said with a shrug. "Don't pay him no mind. You get all kinds of folks around here." Tasha nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Her instincts were screaming at her to leave, to get back in her truck and drive off. But the thought of the empty road stretching on for miles, the oppressive loneliness of it, made her hesitate. A cold draft suddenly swept through the diner, the door opening just enough for a gust of wind to make the neon lights outside flicker. Tasha looked up. The man had risen from his seat, his coat falling heavily behind him like a shadow. And now he was moving toward her. The steps he took were deliberate, almost mechanical. Her heart skipped a beat. The waitress noticed him too. "Hey, we don't want any trouble," she called, her voice suddenly sharper than before. "You need something?" The man didn't answer. His eyes, those cold, pale eyes, locked onto Tasha, and she felt a shiver race down her spine. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. Tasha stood up quickly, almost knocking over her coffee. "I need to go," she stammered, feeling the panic rise in her chest. "Hey," the waitress shouted, more urgently now. "Don't you dare," but the man's hand shot out, gripping Tasha's arm with a strength she hadn't expected. His touch was ice cold, his fingers like skeletal claws. He pulled her close, his lips moving slowly, almost lazily, as if he were savoring the moment. "You shouldn't leave yet," he murmured, his voice low and rough like gravel scraping against metal. "Not before I've had my turn." Tasha's pulse thundered in her ears as she yanked her arm away, but his grip tightened, impossibly strong. She could hear the waitress screaming at the man now, but the noise seemed distant, muffled. The world around Tasha narrowed to just her and the man, his face inches from hers. His skin was as pale as a corpse, his breath rancid with the scent of something foul like old meat. "Let go of me," she gasped, but the man only smiled, a slow, cruel twist of his lips. "I told you," he whispered. "You shouldn't have come here." The waitress lunged from behind the counter, swinging a heavy coffee pot at the man's head. He didn't even flinch. The pot shattered against his skull, but the man only tilted his head, confused, as if he didn't understand why she was bothering him. In the next instant, there was a sound loud and sickening like the cracking of bone. The waitress screamed, and Tasha's breath caught in her throat. The man's face, now grotesque and warped, seemed to stretch and ripple, as if it were made of some flesh that didn't belong to him. The diner's fluorescent lights flickered violently, and in a heartbeat, the man was gone. Not a sound, not a trace, just the smell of something rotting in the air, thick and cloying. Tasha stumbled backward, her breath ragged. Her mind was a haze of terror as she made for the door, not even bothering to grab her things. She bolted outside, the cool night air rushing against her face. When she got to her truck, she looked back, but there was no sign of the man, no sign of the waitress. Just the empty diner, the glow of the neon sign casting long, twisted shadows across the parking lot. The engine roared to life, and Tasha sped off into the night, leaving the truck stop behind. She knew better than to look back again, but as she drove away, one question gnawed at her. What was it that the man had meant when he said she shouldn't have come? And deep down, she knew she'd never find the answer.